Okay, I'm going to very quickly go over some of the technical things for today, and then we will get started. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Native American Heritage Commission's webinar on the Interim UC Native American Cultural Affiliation and Repatriation Policy. My name is Christina Snyder, and I'm a member of the Dry Creek Rancheria Band of Pomo Indians, and I'm the Executive Secretary for the Commission. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the homelands of the Patwin peoples. And now I'd like to briefly walk through some of the logistics for today's webinar. First, we are recording today's presentation, so you should see a little blinking light right now. A recording of this presentation will be made available on our website. You have all been muted and your cameras have been disabled. Ask that you remain muted until we get to the comments and questions portion of today's webinar. Once we get to that portion of today's webinar, you can ask questions by using the raise hand function. If you're using the Zoom app, you should be able to raise your hand using the app controls, but you can also use Alt-Y in Windows or Option-Y on Mac to raise or lower your hand. If you have difficulty, you can also directly message me that you have a question or put a question in the chat box and we'll get to you as soon as we can. If you called in, we'll first go through raised hands for questions, but then we'll open up the webinar for any dial-in questions. At that point, you can unmute your line using *6. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I'll now hand it over to Chairperson Miranda to begin today's presentation.
Welcome, everybody. It's good to see so many familiar faces. Thank you for joining. Just want to set the frame for this. We decided to do this because the UC, one of the reasons is the UC policy, as you all probably know, was issued by the University of California on July 27th as an interim policy. And they are taking comments still until November 15th. And once those comments are received, they're going to be going through those, and their goal is to issue a final policy on or about the end of the year. So we're at a time when tribes and folks that are practicing in the area of repatriation may want to continue to submit comments on the UC policy or have questions about the new legislation that was signed into law concerning the California NAGPRA. That's the Ramos bill, AB 275. There may be questions about how is the UC going to incorporate the new language into the policy, especially at this stage when there's only a couple months left in terms of the goal for their approval of the UC's approval for a final policy. The commission, which has a subcommittee, the Heritage Commission has a subcommittee, and it's comprised of myself and Commissioner Lopez-Kiefer. We have been meeting with the UC since the beginning of the creation of this policy on a somewhat regular basis, including in-person meetings and Zoom calls to talk through the language, to talk through issues. We've submitted 3 pretty lengthy comment letters on the policy, which you all have access to either through our website, or we can get those to you if you need them and you want to review them. We are also posting what is a sort of a lengthy, I would just say detailed summary of what we're going to talk about here today, in case you need it, in a template letter that you may want to send to the UC on the current policy, and also to help understand some of the issues that are coming up in terms of the new Cal-NAGPRA amendments and the implementation of the current UC policy language. And I will just say that, well, first of all, let me just say, I'm calling from Tongva lands, downtown Los Angeles, and I'm really happy to be here and to help and to contribute in whatever way I can in assisting all of you through this process on the UC policy specifically. And then also, there's going to be a lot of things happening in terms of the AB 275 language being implemented. And the commission has a number of responsibilities in that regard. And so we are also looking for input from all of you in terms of, you know, how you see the language playing out on the ground in a manner that it complies with the spirit of NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA, the desire for repatriation of these items back to our tribal communities, and how the commission can help facilitate that in our duties. And also noting that there will be in the future upcoming regulations that the commission will be undertaking once we become staffed with a NAGPRA coordinator, which we are searching for actively right now. Little plug if anyone wants to come work with the commission. I think that's it for opening. What we're gonna do, is go through, we're gonna have our AG, John Appelbaum, our assigned deputy AG, walk us through the basic listing of sort of issues that we've highlighted. And these are issues, or these are concerns and issues, or where we see the language in the current UC policy is not congruent or taking into account the new CalNAGPRA amendments that were in the Ramos bill, AB 275. So this is mostly highlighting those pieces, although there are some carryover issues that we've been commenting on for months in terms of changes that we wanted to see in the policy that haven't happened yet. And we are continuing to talk through those things with the UC team and hopefully get to a place where some of those things are ironed out. But that's the frame here. The crux of it is going to be where the policy needs to be updated to meet the requirements of AB 275, the Ramos bill. So we're gonna do that. Then we're gonna set aside, we're gonna do that quickly in terms of, semi-quickly in terms of explaining the issues, and then open it up for comment questions. And then if we have time to go into a deeper dive on some of these things, also noting that we are open and amenable to setting aside time for another webinar like this to do a deeper dive into some of the things, because they may be more complex, like the determination of cultural affiliation. How is that going to happen? That's an example of something that's probably warrants a larger discussion here. So I will first turn it over to Commissioner Lopez-Kiefer if you have any thing that you would want to convey to the group.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you, Executive Secretary Snyder, for inviting me today. I just want to say hello to everyone. So Miyam, and also give a land acknowledgement to where I'm calling in from, which is Bay Miwok and Ohlone land, which is also known today as the City of Martinez. I am here today to listen, as well as respond to any inquiries that I might be able to provide additional clarification on, but really interested in listening to everybody's concerns, observations when it comes to the UC policy as it currently stands, and AB 275, specifically CalNAGPRA. And if you believe that the policy sufficiently addresses the concerns, or at least a new law of AB 275. So thank you, Chairwoman, and I will go on mute so I can be listening along with everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you. And also to note, we do have some representatives from the UC on this call. We didn't formalize the agenda where they would speak to anything, but just know if you have questions, we can note them either. I don't know if the chat's open or somebody is jotting things down, but they're definitely here and may be receptive to some of the questions too, or we'll at least take them back and talk them through internally. John? Or are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I really appreciate the chance to speak to everyone on this issue. As was noted, I work for the Attorney General's office, and I represent the Native American Heritage Commission on a number of different issues, and I've worked with the NAHC on UC repatriation, along with Madam Chair and Commissioner Lopez Kiefer and Executive Secretary Snyder. It's no exaggeration to say that AB 275 is really a sea change in state law regarding repatriation. In fairness to the UC, at the time it did its interim policy, AB 275 was not yet law. It is now. The UC anticipates finalizing its policy for January of 2021. And our expectation would be that those changes incorporate AB 275. For all those of you who may not necessarily have followed this, the biggest issue was the tribal list. And that is which tribes are eligible to participate in state repatriation. And the old state law relied on an outdated federal law, Code of Federal Regulations, and it created confusion as to what tribes were exactly allowed to participate or not participate beyond just federally recognized tribes. And so AB 275 clarified that. So tribes now that are on the contact list maintained by the commission, and that's the list that's generally used for CEQA, or the California Environmental Quality Act purposes. That's generally the list that of tribes that are now eligible to participate in state repatriation, and that's going to include non-federally recognized tribes. And that's a significant departure from NAGPRA, which limits formal repatriation to federally recognized tribes. So the biggest challenge the UC is going to have is integrating the California state Native American tribes into its policy and into its processes. The first challenge is going to be by January of 2022, the UC has to update its inventories and create preliminary inventories based upon state cultural affiliation. And that is going to rely upon consultations with California state Native American tribes as defined under AB 275, which is the list that the commission maintains. I think what's really neat about AB 275 is prior to conducting any inventories, the UC must consult with affiliated California tribes, which are identified by the commission. And that's kind of a new issue now, because when the UC now goes to assemble its inventories, it has to consult with tribes right from the get-go. It has to consult with the tribes about what goes into the inventory. And that can be really significant, because there may be items that the UC may not understand are related to burials that a new tribal perspective or consultation will help educate them about. The other big difference with AB 275 is disagreements. If there are disagreements over the contents of an inventory, the UC has to reach consensus with the tribes. And an inventory can never be final until the consulting tribes agree it's final. And that is a sea change. Under the existing UC interim policy, the UC gets to determine if an inventory is final. And the burden is on the tribes to appeal that to the chancellor and the related committees. And that's a huge change because the emphasis now is going to be on deferring to California Native tribes, and the emphasis is going to be on reaching consensus through consultation, and the consultation breaks down through mediation. And there's a new requirement that the commission create a mediation process, which if we have time, we'll go over. So the UC then has to create these preliminary inventories. That's something that they have not had to do under their existing UC interim policy. After they complete a preliminary inventory, they submit it to the commission. The commission then publishes it on its website for 30 days. That's a really important new step that's not in the UC interim policy. It's important because it allows other tribes to see what's on the preliminary inventory, to assess it for themselves. It may be possible that there are tribes that the commission didn't identify that have an interest in those items, and those tribes then have an opportunity to consult with the UC about the preliminary inventory and summaries that it has created. So that's a rather significant change in the law that the UC is going to have to incorporate. As I mentioned, if there are disagreements, then a preliminary inventory, which the commission posts on its website, and the commission will actually post whether it's preliminary or final. And if there's a disagreement even after a preliminary inventory becomes final, it can be brought back and the commission can list it as preliminary again if there's a dispute. And it remains preliminary until that dispute is resolved. And it's certainly the commission's position that AB 275 runs concurrently with NAGPRA, which the UC is also subject to. And our expectation would be that if there are disagreements, particularly with federally recognized tribes under NAGPRA, that those can also be mediated through our process. Let's see. All right, determining cultural affiliation. The biggest change to the UC interim policy is going to be the role of tribal knowledge. I think a lot of tribes have expressed frustration that the UC has generally not deferred to tribal knowledge, or has found that tribal knowledge lacks sufficient evidentiary basis, or that there are gaps in tribal knowledge. AB 275 alters that by making it clear that tribal knowledge is to be given deference under AB 275 for determining state cultural affiliation, and that state tribal knowledge by itself may be sufficient to meet the standard of proof, which is preponderance of the evidence. And that's designed to eliminate those types of disputes where an agency like the UC may say, well, we require more than just traditional knowledge. We require genealogical information or direct historical information. This is basically making clear that that cannot be a basis for denying state cultural affiliation. And the reality is that in most instances, tribal knowledge forms the basis of most tribes' information about the items anyway. So it's the reality of the situation. And that's a big change, and that's going to be a significant change for the UC interim policy, which does not recognize tribal knowledge as being sufficient by itself to meet the standard of proof. As I mentioned, if tribes are permitted to dispute cultural affiliation under AB 275, if they do that, a preliminary inventory cannot be final until that dispute is resolved. That's a significant change from the UC interim policy, which, as I mentioned before, the UC determines if an inventory is final, and it's up to the tribe to appeal that or to take that up to the chancellor and his or her related committees. So the burden now is no longer on the tribes. The tribes then are allowed to resolve the disputes between themselves. And if they are unable to do that, it goes through a formal mediation process through the commission. Let's see. Final inventory. So after an inventory has been posted on the commission's website for 30 days, and all of the consulting tribes listed concur with the information in it, then it can become final. If there are disagreements over a final inventory, even after the fact, then a final inventory can become preliminary again until the issue is mediated and resolved between the tribes. So the emphasis here is clearly on the tribes reaching consensus and agreement, which is a significant departure from the existing UC interim policy. Let's see. Claims. So under the claims process is also substantially different. Under AB 275, claims are filed with both the commission and the UC. Under the UC interim policy, claims are filed with the UC directly. And under AB 275, a tribe has to show one or both of the following: a shared group identity, that is, that there's a shared group identity that can reasonably be traced historically with an earlier identifiable group from which the claims or the items originated. This is conclusively proven if the item was published in the Federal Register under NAGPRA for that tribe, or state Aboriginal territory. That tribe can demonstrate that the remains or cultural items were removed from the state Aboriginal territory of the claiming tribe. That's a pretty substantial deviation from the UC interim policy, which doesn't really discuss state Aboriginal territory. So state Aboriginal territory now will become a basis for tribes making claims for items. And that will be done with the assistance of the commission, which will be providing the list of potentially affiliated tribes to the UC for that determination. As far as state cultural affiliation and making claims, the UC interim policy makes it optional for tribes to pursue state repatriation. AB 275 makes it mandatory. So tribes who are subject to both NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA will still need to go through the CalNAGPRA process and complete that process along with NAGPRA. And our expectation would be that those two processes go concurrently to avoid any potential delay in repatriation. One difference that's, I think, kind of significant is the UC interim policy doesn't provide a process for the UC to object to a proposed repatriation, including raising concerns about cultural affiliation or NAGPRA's potential application leading to a different result. That can be really significant, right? Because the UC may become aware of information suggesting that perhaps a tribe is not culturally affiliated, or the UC may have concerns about federal NAGPRA, such that it is determined that a federally recognized tribe is entitled to remains, let's say, over a non-federally recognized tribe. If that's the case, it's important for the UC to be able to raise those concerns so that they can be addressed and potentially mediated. You know, our expectation would be that the mediation process can help assist some of those situations. And it may be that you have federally recognized tribes deferring to non-federally recognized in instances where cultural affiliation is much closely tied to the non-federally recognized tribe. Another big component of AB 275 are repatriation agreements. I think the UC and all state agencies recognize the importance of tribes reaching agreements. And it's been particularly instrumental for UCLA, which often uses these agreements to allow non-federally recognized tribes to participate in the NAGPRA process. The big difference with AB 275 is going to be that the commission will receive copies of repatriation agreements, and the commission has the power to enforce those agreements. That's a rather significant change from existing law. It's not reflected in the UC interim policy, but it is a rather significant power, and the expectation being making it much easier for tribes to get agreements enforced should disputes arise about them. I don't know if anybody has any questions, because I'm flying through a lot of material and I'm flying through very fast. So I'm happy to answer potential questions or keep moving through.
Do we want to take questions on this segment? Because we want you to keep at least moving through to do the overview. And then we can take questions. But yes, I get this is dense material. And so we can take questions on what's been said thus far. If folks have questions, I guess we're going to do the raise your hand function here in the participants section. If you click on that, there will be an ability for you to I think do a hand raise. I'm not sure though. Christina, I don't know what functions you have open or how you envision doing this.
Yeah, so we can do a hand raise. We can also do the chat. And if people, they can also unmute themselves. So they're able to do that on their end too.
So are there any questions thus far? Or
the good news is it's all in the outline, the materials that you have, the specifics.
Chairwoman, this is Commissioner Lopez-Kiefer. I think if we can go ahead and get through the ongoing concern section, I think there might be more discussion on that. Given the fact that AB 275 was not law at the time that the interim policy was developed, you know, maybe we can hear from Lourdes as far as what the UC's commitment is as far as addressing the issue of 275 that's been outlined here. But I think there might be more discussion and observations about what we have listed as the ongoing concerns.
Okay, let's keep going, John, and then we'll get, we'll see where we're at once we're through this.
Okay. All right, so
We
another
have 2 hours, right?
I think so.
Okay.
So another significant change under AB 275 that I identified earlier was dispute resolution. NAGPRA kind of has a voluntary dispute resolution process that parties can go through. AB 275 makes a formal process and makes it mandatory. So if there's a dispute, the parties notify the commission. After notifying the commission about the dispute, they have 30 days to meet and confer to resolve the dispute. If they are unable to resolve it, then the commission appoints a mediator, and it goes through a mediation process where the parties submit briefs. You have a complainant's brief due within 20 days, responding brief due 20 days thereafter. And then there's a mediation session. And ultimately, I think what makes AB 275 unique, and I hope really helpful, is if the parties aren't able to resolve their differences through that process, then within 7 days afterwards, the mediator issues his or her decision. That's a significant departure from anything in the UC interim policy, and it's departure from NAGPRA, because now the parties have a decision. It's not enforceable or binding on the parties, but it's a really helpful tool, because the expectation would be that they will see somebody who has expertise, what their reasoning is, and hopefully that resolves the dispute. AB 275 goes one step further, right? If the parties are still unable to resolve the dispute, then they can take it to the commission. The dispute then would be heard by the commission itself. And then the commission would issue a decision which would become a final administrative remedy. And then the parties, if they're still unable to resolve their dispute, could take it to court if they so choose. So that whole process is a rather significant departure from the UC interim policy, which relies exclusively on NAGPRA and NAGPRA's voluntary mediation process. The other,
And also, I may have missed this. Did you say that mention the current policy is that the disputes are and the appeals are handled internally through the chancellor? So that's the way it's presently drafted.
right, that's correct. And that's a big change. That's a rather substantial change, Madam Chair, and I'm glad you raised that, because under the UC policy, the burden is on the tribe to raise a dispute, and it has to go through the internal UC process. AB 275 changes that dynamic, because now the burden is no longer on the tribe to file an appeal, but rather the burden is on the UC to stop, wait, let the tribes mediate the issue, and let the tribes resolve it. So it's just a much different way of handling disputes. And of course, the parties under AB 275, they still have the ability, if they want, to also use NAGPRA mediation to assist in resolving the dispute. I'm not sure too many tribes would want to do that, unless, I guess, if they're federally recognized, they might want to try to use that process as well. But I really think AB 275's process is going to be the process of choice, and will lead to more resolutions. The other big difference, I talked about the definition of a California Indian tribe being changed. Also, a big difference between the UC interim policy and AB 275 is confidential information. AB 275 provides that consultation has to recognize the tribe's potential need for confidentiality with respect to tribal traditional knowledge and all tribal information shared during consultation. And that kind of dovetails with the Public Records Act, which exempts from public disclosures records related to sacred places, Native American objects, and records that the agency obtains through the consultation process. So those two dovetail quite nicely. And so AB 275 recognizes the need for confidentiality of tribal traditional knowledge and tribal information shared during consultations, that is to be maintained as confidential. The UC interim policy, by contrast, let's see, it extends confidentiality only to records related to places that have traditional tribal cultural significance without defining what this phrase means, and puts the burden on the tribes to identify the information used by them as confidential during consultations. So the AB 275 would make those things automatic so that tribes consulting with the UC would have the assurance that what they're sharing with the UC will remain confidential. And they don't have to necessarily tell the UC, oh, by the way, this is confidential information. And also it expands the definition of confidential information to include traditional tribal knowledge and anything shared during consultation. So it clarifies that for the UC. The other big the other big issue, I think it's a significant issue to some degree. AB 275 defines a museum in part as an agency, person, or entity, including a higher educational institution that receives state funds. And this definition isn't in the UC interim policy, but I think it's significant. It's significant because one of the things that the state auditor determined was there were a number of items missing from UC inventories, items that had been lent out where the UC was unable to track them down. It appears that researchers may have taken items and there wasn't a good tracking mechanism to figure out where they went. And so I think it's going to be really important for the UC to make clear to its institutions that this is going to apply to not only to all departments and research institutions, but individuals as well. And our expectation would be that when it comes to searches to identify items, that they're going to have to undertake efforts to contact individual professors and researchers to determine if they may have Native American remains and cultural items that may have gone missing because there wasn't adequate record keeping. And now I was going to transition into our ongoing concerns. Madam Chair, I think, did you want to pause and take questions at this point before I talk about our ongoing concerns?
Well, I do think we should pause and take questions or comments. I also just wanted to mention on the topic you were just talking about with the definition of museum, the definition of possession is related there as well, where the current UC interim policy omits the definition of possession. And I think that that's an important piece in understanding what items are potentially subject to the CalNAGPRA, what they have control over, and that expectation of how those things will be addressed. So that was another piece related that I think dovetails in there. Let's go ahead, and if anybody, so we've just gone through just a really cursory, I just want to say, like, seriously, very cursory sort of topical listing of all the points in AB 275, Ramos bill, the new amendments to CalNAGPRA, that are not, we do not think are captured in the current UC interim policy that has been adopted in July, but has been deemed as interim. The UC is still taking comments. And it's my understanding, and we'll get to this a little bit later, that the UC is currently working to bring the policy language in compliance with what is now current law. So we will get to that, whole aspect later about what the UC is doing. But right now, let's stay with the sort of topical subject matter things that are going on here that we've just discussed. Do folks have any questions about things, want further discussion on certain topics that we just went through? Even if you're not completely clear what your question might be, but are looking for clarification. I mean, I'm like that. I'm like, I don't quite understand sometimes what language is driving at. So please don't be shy about asking into that, because we're all going through this right now of combing through this language and better understanding it and how to apply it.
And again, if you have a question, you can unmute yourself on the Zoom app. If you had called in, it's *6 to unmute your line. You can also enter a question into the chat box.
Are folks sort of, I mean, I'm curious. Oh, I see a hand on the virtual. Douglas?
Let's see.
Do you?
I was just tugging my ear. Sorry about that. But I do have a question, and this has to do with. Let me preface this by saying I'm learning more about the interim policy as well as the AP 275. And one question I have is the applicability. Does AB 275 apply, for example, to UC, regardless of whether a campus has a NAGPRA eligible collection or not?
I think that's a great question. So, I mean, I would say that our position is that it does, because how do you know if you have something that's NAGPRA eligible until you do the inquiry, which is squarely laid out in the law. So that's the position we're taking right now. To what extent that requires, a campus, separate campus policy aside from the system-wide UC policy, that's a different question. But that is one reason, and let's just go to bigger picture, with the Gloria bill, which was AB 2836, which 2 years ago amended into the CalNAGPRA. That's what required the UC to now update their policy. That's sort of the backbone and the intent of the Gloria bill 2836, and then now continuing into with the Ramos bill, is that the authors and the tribal sponsors wanted there to be a broader applicability to be able to facilitate repatriation. So I wholly believe that was the intent behind it, plus broadening the way the UC would carry this out, why the commission got put in with a role, a specific role. So it's not just the UC making determinations internally, saying yes, saying no, making these really important decisions without sometimes the tribal perspective, quite honestly, being factored in. So this is to pull out, to enable repatriation to wholly 100% at some point. I mean, it may take a long time for that to happen. And I think that can only happen if like AG Appelbaum was saying, there is a general applicability broadly to the entire UC, requiring them to look everywhere that there's possibly NAGPRA eligible items, talk to the tribes when it's a possibility of a NAGPRA eligible item to gain their information, to then, you know, facilitate that, make a decision, and move forward.
Chair Miranda, may I ask another question?
Yes, I don't see any other hands.
Go
ahead.
It has to do with the articulation of the, I think you referred to the air quality or the CEQA statutes. How does the AB 275 articulate or interact?
With what other statutes?
He's talking about CEQA.
It's CEQA, exactly.
Oh, well, I mean, that's a, okay, in a general sense, that the most immediate answer is it kind of doesn't like directly interface with CEQA. They're kind of two different topics, okay. But where it does kind of interface here is, and why AG Appelbaum mentioned it, is because the list, so the clarification of for the definition of California Indian tribes, it is now using an existing definition in law, which was originally appeared in the planning law, the government code for SB 18, and then is also utilized in CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, for the implementation of AB 52. So it's that same list that is now going to be the NAGPRA list of tribes. But it's an existing list that's been around. So SB 18, I think, was 2005, maybe. I'm not sure. It's been in existence for a while. So that is the interface there. And then, I mean, the other interface from just a practical perspective is that if collections are excavated during a CEQA process and they land in a museum that, or what is defined as a museum under Cal NAGPRA, that, you know, there could be some dovetail there in terms of interplay. So, I mean, my personal recommendation is just for tribes to start doing those agreements early about, you know, repatriation of items in a CEQA project, so they know, so they don't end up inadvertently in a facility, and then a tribe has to go through like a double process, first CEQA to try to protect them, and then they've got to repatriate them after the fact. So that is another place that it might dovetail that I see. I don't know if you all are seeing something different, Commissioner and John.
No, actually, I was just going to direct everybody to the chat. Linda Rugg had made a comment in it addressing Douglas's concern, which is basically you don't know what you have that's NAGPRA eligible until you start looking. And so because of AB 275, it truly allows the tribes to be part of that process, that collaborative process of what are you holding and what is the significance. So I think that is really important to hear, especially coming from Berkeley and Linda Rugg. I have great respect for her. So I think that shows the UC's commitment really to trying to work where they can in repatriating. That's all I was going to say.
Well, I'm glad you raised that. I hope that answered your questions, Douglas. I also, on that point, there was a good amount of discussion with us and the UC on rewording that kind of language and throughout the policy document where it just says NAGPRA eligible items, and it should be saying potentially NAGPRA eligible items, because how do you know? So all of these inquiries should be surrounding a broader, search and find of all of these things, and allowing the tribes to have input on what is ultimately defined as a NAGPRA eligible item. Okay, let's see what's next. We have no other hands raised that I see on the screen.
Hi, Laura. This is Lourdes.
Okay, Lourdes, okay, what did you want to talk about?
I just want to make a quick comment. So Doug is here because we've been involving all of our campuses in these discussions, whether they have a NAGPRA eligible collection or not. And we very much understand that we need to go through our inventories and have built that into our policy. There are a number of things that I've heard here today where I think we do address it in our policy, but maybe we need to make it a little bit more clear, or a lot more clear, because it's there, but maybe it's not as obvious. So like for instance, one is where we can make a cultural affiliation based on tribal knowledge alone, or tribal evidence, and we state that very clearly in our policy, I thought, but maybe we need to go back and make sure that it's more clear. I just wanted to say that because I think that there are a number of areas where I think we have addressed, or at least have mentioned these things, and maybe we need to make them more clear. No doubt, let me just caveat that with saying that no doubt we need to go back and revisit all of the language because of AB 275, and we need to incorporate it. So.
Okay.
So I mean, Lourdes, it wasn't AB 275 wasn't law at the time you did it, and you guys do mention tribal knowledge. It's the level of deference that you're going to have to change.
Right.
Right.
And
I don't want to get into a back and forth here. Like I really don't, because Lourdes, we've given you our comments, and we've specifically told you how the language does not capture, even though you think it does. We've specifically walked you through how the language does not align with 275, and we will continue to do that, and we're open to doing that. And your acknowledgement that there is some work left to do. Thank you for saying that. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think that hearing your commitment to capture 275 in the UC policy means a lot to this community. And I know it means a lot to the commission, and we're ready to support you in any way that we can, and also being aware of timeframes and knowing that situation as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see.
And Chairwoman, I don't know if we really, captured the outstanding comments, or
we haven't done that yet. So okay. Now I guess we're going to move on.
Because I just want to note the time. I think we only have about 30 minutes left. So I just want to make sure we get to that.
I think we can do the outstanding comments in 5 minutes. I mean, just hit on them. If you want to, John. I wouldn't mind just talking about the consultation piece, because that's the first one, is the continual comment that we've been raising in all of our comment letters. When I say we, I mean the commission, the Native American Heritage Commission, is the UC's compliance with the consultation requirements that were set forth in the Gloria Bill, AB 2836, for how to create this UC policy that we now have before us. So it continues to be the position of the commission that that the consultation components were not adequately met during this process. And I know the UC disagrees with that. I don't want to get into a back and forth here about that either. I would just hope that we could, and I think the UC marking this as an interim policy and giving this round of opportunity for tribes to submit comments now is a huge step towards the inclusivity of having tribes assist in the actual formation of this policy. But the UC has not largely responded to tribes' comments that they've submitted thus far. So we don't know in terms of transparency as to why certain comments were either rejected or incorporated, or what the UC's position is on many of those tribal comments, and many of the NHC comments, as a matter of fact. So there is that sort of piece of due process, if you will, with that is in sort of a standard consultation process where you would have a back and forth, you would have meaningful discussions, and you would seek to reach some type of an agreement on certain things. So that's one part of our ongoing comments, is that, and then during COVID, that sort of, threw a monkey wrench into everything. The UC did do the in-person listening sessions. Maybe there could have been more. We were hoping there would be more. We were hoping there would be more interaction on the different drafts and more responses to comments throughout the drafting process. So that's just, generally speaking, one of our previously raised comments. The other, let's see, I think there's just 2 others, right, John? Do you want to go through those? Or yeah, there was, oh, well, this kind of dovetails the updating of the CUI determinations. So anything that was determined culturally unaffiliated CUI, there was the ability to, or to go back and review those and attempt to move them out of the CUI. But I think that sort of dovetails and is one of the reasons that the Ramos bill asks for a re-inventory and a re-summary of items, because it's envisioned you're going to go through and attempt to move as many things out of a CUI categorization as you can. I don't know if there's more on that, but that was an ongoing comment that we had, is about clearly having a clear system-wide, iteration of a step-by-step of how you were going to get things moved out of this CUI categorization into something that was NAGPRA eligible, Cal-NAGPRA eligible, both to be repatriated. And it wasn't completely, the language that's in there, it wasn't completely clear how that was going to happen. And that's also to Douglas's point of, you know, a broader applicability to make sure we're not missing anything, because maybe once it gets put on a CUI list, it's sort of off the radar as something potentially to be repatriated. And so how do you focus in on those things?
So, Madam Chair, just to kind of build on what you were saying, I mean, one issue that we previously raised with the UC has to do with searches. So the state auditor found a number of problems with the way the UC had been managing its collections, including the inability to find where remains and items had gone. And for instance, the UC interim policy says that the repatriation coordinator is supposed to send a communication, whatever that means, to all campus department deans or chairs, providing definitions of remains and cultural items, so that the department deans or chairs can make what's called an informed initial assessment about whether their departments potentially hold remains or cultural items. It then says those individuals are to return the assessment, confirming that they have conducted a search. The problem with this is, what the heck is an initial, an informed initial assessment? I don't know what that means. I really doubt a department head's gonna know what that means either. And it doesn't give them guidance. I mean, one of the things that you're supposed to have is a system-wide policy for identifying items. And this doesn't do it. So in my estimation, the policy needs to be revised to give better guidance, systematic guidance to individuals as to how do I do a search? What does a search entail? And the types of efforts they should be undertaking, and timeliness of those efforts, right? I mean, here the policy, the UC interim policy, doesn't mention anything about how much time these chairs and deans can take. So under this policy, theoretically, a dean could just send an email out to all professors saying, hey, you got any remains? And then wait a couple months, oh, I didn't get a response, good enough. And while I hope that wouldn't happen, right, it's a possibility under this policy. And so as a lawyer, I always look at that and say, well, you always kind of assume worst case scenario, that the worst is going to happen. And so the policy really needs to be revised to come into compliance with AB 2036 in identifying items from the get-go and getting the tribes in that process so that they can see the items as well. And it may be that an item that the UC thought was not related to a burial actually is. I'm sorry, Madam Chair.
No, that's great. That's great. I think that's really helpful. So are we done at 2:30 or 3?
We've slated this for 2:30. We could go beyond if it goes longer.
Okay.
Madam Chair, and just so you know, I have a hard stop at 2:30. But
Okay.
Thank you.
So we'll go back into questions now. If anybody has a question.
It'd be really helpful also for us to hear if you agree, if you can concur with our assessment or what we're saying or our ongoing concerns with the policy, just so we can hear from you where you're thinking about the policy and what you'd like us to make sure we're including in our comments. So if you found yourself nodding your head in agreement, if you could voice that so that we can hear you and your thoughts can be part of this discussion and record.
So we have a raised hand from Melody McAdams, if you'd like to unmute your line now.
Hi, this is Melody McAdams. Thank you for letting me ask some questions. I did want to just mention that I have been nodding along. United Auburn Indian Community strongly supported AB 275. And I think that a lot of what is in AB 275 is not currently in the UC policy. We appreciate all the progress that has been made with the UC policy, but I don't think that AB 275 would have been passed if it, if the UC policy had addressed those issues. My questions though were, I was interested in two items, whether the Heritage Commission is planning to interface with CSU museums and state agencies regarding AB 275. And then my second question was I was hoping to hear the Heritage Commission's take on the portion of AB 275.
You're cutting out, Melody.
Oh, I apologize. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
I was hoping to hear the Heritage Commission's.
Oh, you went out again.
Can you hear me better now? Hello?
Yes.
We can, but you go in and out, unfortunately.
I apologize. It's working from home has made issues of reception more difficult. I was hoping to hear the Heritage Commission's thoughts on the portion of AB 275 that discusses broad categorical identifications of cultural items. For example, identifying everything from a burial site as a funerary object, because I know this has been a big issue.
So I can speak to the first piece because it's less complicated, and then the commissioners and John can speak to the second piece. We are required to notice all museums as defined of the completion of the list, which is complete, as you'll see in the chat box. So that is, we're planning on doing everything we need to do under 275. Beyond that, I think we can have that conversation, but we'll have to look at what our capacity is. We're planning on hiring a NAGPRA attorney by the end of the year, so we should have a bit more capacity to be more proactive in that piece. But for the near term, for the CSUs and other covered entities, which now includes, I believe, persons and other similar types of collections that are a bit more difficult to reach, we will think about how to do that. But I imagine that CSUs are next on the list. But so that's a non-answer, but yes, we'll be turning to that when we have a bit more capacity. Chairperson?
Yeah, my head spins when I think about all of the entities that will come under this museum definition. So we're taking it one step at a time. Thank you, Christina. So I actually am going to throw it back at you, Melody. Like I really want to hear from you why this piece is so important and what was sort of missing or what tribes were not able to do before that they might now be able to do with this language. Because it seems that this language goes to the heart of, this deference to traditional knowledge and the actual understanding of the context of the items. So I'm going to sort of toss it back to you to put a little more color on that so we can understand what specifically you wanted to point out about this language.
Thank you. So as a repatriation coordinator for United Auburn, I received direction from my oversight committee that burial sites and cemeteries were dedicated and that everything at that site is a funerary object, which makes it really straightforward for me to do repatriations because that's very clear guidance. However, when consulting with museums, I almost every single time received pushback on this definition and would have to either prove object by object or item type by item type that something was a funerary object, which just made repatriation very burdensome and also made it difficult to bring tribal elders or traditionalists into the repatriation because they would say what their traditional cultural knowledge was and would be met with, that doesn't conform to the legal definition of NAGPRA. We couldn't find that anywhere in the legal definitions of funerary objects, but that was kind of what we heard. So, you know, we really wanted to see a law or statute where it says it is reasonable, because it seemed very reasonable already to say that it's more likely than not that everything from a burial site is a funerary object. So this was just an ongoing battle every single time. So we were hoping to not have to fight that battle every time.
Understood, and that's very helpful. We have not discussed onto that factual level of those circumstances. We're actually sort of walking through sort of case scenarios and factual circumstances with the UC. We started doing that because I think it's very helpful to sort of apply this language to exactly what you're saying, like the on the ground situations that are happening. And so we've been starting to do that, but this is one piece we haven't talked through. I mean, I am seeing it, and John and Commissioner Lopez-Kiefer, please weigh in, but I'm seeing it as sort of directly a piece that falls from this deference to tribal knowledge. And if tribal knowledge encompasses the ritual and the way of, carrying out certain practices, then I don't see, again, these are all fact-based, inquiries when you have a particular situation at hand. So it's hard to really say generally, yes, every time you have A, you have B, or whatever the equation is. But it seems that if that's the case, if this is part of funerary practices, if this is part of the dedication, if this is part of the traditional practice and the ritual and the ceremony, and how the tribal view, because remember, I mean, we all know this, we're functioning in this, I'll just say it, this weirdo legal land of, of putting hard walled box definitions on things, which tribal people don't do. Like, we're not doing that when we're saying what's sacred, or we're describing a ceremony or a practice, or the value of something. We're not categorizing it that way. So we're already, it's already difficult, and that's why you've run into all these difficulties with then being forced into an item by item inquiry, which is not fair if you have, overarching data evidentiary support that does show, how this item, all these items were used, that they were dedicated, et cetera, whatever the situation is. So, I mean, that's sort of my read of it, but again, we haven't delved into this, but definitely want to hear more about the specific examples that you all are running into in repatriation, in the sort of on the ground negotiations with whoever's on the other side. I don't want to, make it adversarial, but oftentimes it does feel like we're trying to put up evidence against another entity that's putting up contrary evidence. And I think that both of these laws, these new CalNAGPRA updates, are all about trying to take that sort of adversarialism out and trying to foster through not only the deference to the tribal knowledge, but also this whole this ability to have discussions, to reach agreement, to have mediation, to have all these junctures for trying to reach agreement. Its intention is to cut some of this back and forth out if possible. I don't know if that's going to happen. Fingers crossed. So, as much as we can do that and help facilitate that, we're happy to.
We have a question from Courtney Ann Coyle. If you'd like to unmute your line.
Thanks, Madam Secretary. I'm Courtney Coyle. I am outside counsel for United Auburn, and we were the bill sponsors, as Mel said, for the 275. Just wanted to thank the commission for hosting this Zoom and for John for preparing the comparison document. I think that'll really help in preparing, additional comments on the interim policy and how that squares with the 275. As people have said, CalNAGPRA is a really complicated area of the law, and there may be needs to fine tune different things as we implement it. But I just wanted to say that Melody and I, United Auburn, we spent, I don't know how many hours on how many calls with Lourdes and the UC. They were productive in many respects, and I think that's reflected in the interim policy. But there were areas, as Mel said, where we couldn't gain traction, that it was too hard of a sell for the UC. And it's those items that we couldn't get to an understanding on that kind of got built into the 275 bill. So they were very intentional, and they were aimed to hit items that Mel and others have encountered in trying to do the repatriations out there with the UC, but also with non-UC folks. This bill is more than UC. I know this call is focused on the UC. So I don't want to take away from all those telephone calls and the investment that Lourdes and others have made to get to this policy, which is better than the prior policy. But what you see in 275 were items that we could not get traction on. And I think it's really important for everybody to understand that. 275 had to happen to fix the issue with the definition of California tribes, and that was really important. But there's other things that are built into that are based off of real life examples, and we were not able to get into the interim policy. So I'm glad that DUC will be looking at this, and the commission is looking at this, and it's our hope that this bill really makes things better, makes the experience of the repatriation process better for California tribes. It's so onerous, so difficult, so many barriers to repatriation that we were trying to intentionally take away some of those barriers that we identified. So thank you again for convening this webinar, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Okay, we're at 2:26 time-wise. I don't see any other hand raise. I do want to say, just also remind everybody that the commission has just sent out the call for candidates, nominations for the UC committees, the system-wide committee, and the campus committees that will be responsible for carrying out this UC policy that we're discussing here. And Christina, do you want to just, I don't have the deadlines written out. I think we're taking nominations to the end of November, or can
We're
you go through
taking
the
nomination. Yeah, we're taking nominations through December 18th. But you know, if you can front load those, it's easier on us because we have to process and make sure that they fit all of the qualifications. If as you're going through, you see anything that is unclear, we can amend the materials to make it a bit more clear about what is required. We don't want this to be a hurdle to people who really want to help and who could fit the qualifications. So if you think that you may fit most of them, but you have some questions, we're happy to provide technical assistance, or feel free to submit and we can have that conversation on the back end too.
So anybody that's interested in serving, please submit your candidacy. It's super important. I hope we have, fingers crossed, we have more than enough candidates, because what we're going to do is put them in a continual sort of holding pool so that in case folks, you know, drop off after a year or don't want to, you know, continue serving, that we have a pool of candidates to continue to go from, to refresh and refill the committees. So any other, oh, go ahead.
That link for everyone is in the chat as well. There have been a bunch of links in the chat. So before we end, I encourage everyone to take a look, because the document that John was speaking from and the commissioners were speaking from is also in the chat box.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon and sharing your comments and concerns with us. Greatly appreciate it. And we look forward to hopefully having another session if there is demand for it. And thank you, everybody. I've got to jump off now. No Sholovic, my heart is good. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Okay, thank you, everybody.